Hi, this is Paul. Part of the reason I think yesterday's video took me so many tries to make was the usual problem with just about any singular message sermon, too many disconnected thoughts. Now, having a lot of disconnected thoughts is not necessarily a bad thing if you can overcome the challenge and connect the disconnected thoughts, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I believe these thoughts are in one way or another connected. The challenge is always to show the connections between them. In the end, the decision that I made was separate some of these thoughts and do multiple videos instead of just one. Part of that has to do with the limited amount of time I have every day to make videos. Another part of that has to do with the fact that sometimes it's better to have them segmented off, even if it's an hour or an hour and a half, as one video. What I want to get into is question of evil and gender and God. Now, that's some pretty big stuff, especially when I'm going to approach it with the critical drinker. Now, as has become my practice after I do a video where I had a bunch of new thoughts and differentiated thoughts, I needed to write a little something for Twitter. And if I'm writing a little something for Twitter, that's more than one or two entries, I formulate it onto my Substack. And for those of you who, as would be true of any normal human being with real responsibility, don't have enough time to watch all of my videos unless your life has a particular kind of job, or you're retired, or for some other reason where you can really catch them all, sort of like a Pokemon. The Substack is sort of a good way to keep up with things for me because it's fairly short. I did the egregore video. I did something about weddings. That was in anticipation of a sermon. I did the Babylon Bee thing. I did the Tom Holland thing. So the Substack is a pretty good way to sort of keep up with things. And the Substack is never simply a summary of the video because I usually do it the next morning and I've had a night to sleep on it. And so it's usually a summary plus a little bit more. So maybe I'll start with the Substack. Last week, I opened up a new vein of exploration on another YouTuber, The Critical Drinker. Today, I released the second video in that series on his angry, profanity-laced tirade about what he sees as the corruption of Hollywood storytelling. I haven't seen a video of mine do what the first in this series did, so when I started commenting on Jordan Peterson. Those of you, obviously, don't have regular access to all the analytics that Google feeds me on my channel, but if you just go to the first video, Critical Drinker, Peugeot, Jordan Peterson, Religion and the Hero's Journey, that video has taken off, and it's been out for, it was out on the 4th, so almost a week now. And usually what happens with my videos is they sort of peak at the height when a whole bunch of people, those of you who watch most of them, sort of jump on, and then they sort of tail off, and then they're just out there forgotten into the world. Well, this video just keeps living. And every now and then I'll check it, and there'll be another several hundred views in 60 minutes, and on and on and on. So now it's over 20,000 views, which is a pretty remarkable thing for my little channel. So obviously stuff is going on. I don't really understand what. We'll see. I'm better prepared now, though, for the kind of thing that I experienced when I first started my channel. If you go back to some of my first videos, you'll see me I think 2,000 subscribers is enough for this channel. And, well, that didn't happen to be. But we have an estuary now, and it sort of reminds me of when my Protestant colleague spoke with his Orthodox friend out there in Roseville, and the Orthodox friend basically said, well, we're not ready to do evangelism yet. We haven't set up our cathedrals or our monasteries yet. Oh, well, we've got an estuary now so that if there are hundreds more people who start flooding into the channel, there's some place for them to go. And I think the estuary is built up sufficiently now that they have strong walls and good culture so that newcomers can, in fact, perhaps find a niche and positive conversation. The critical drinker is both popular and easy to dismiss for the same reasons. One, he's hitting on current popular culture war tropes, the sort of dynamic that will boost your YouTube analytics, as Megan Dahm and David Fuller talked about. He sticks mostly to major blockbuster movies, an area of film criticism that often serious critics turn away from because they are the joy of the rabble. 3, there's no doubt in my mind that many who follow him are indulging in the common guilty pleasure of nursing a favorite tribal grudge, fueled at least in part by the mix of nostalgia and resentment. The critical drinker, however, doesn't really play this straight. Like many other channels I could point to, he adopts now, some people said, yeah, but that's really how Scotsmen are. It's like, well, I guess I don't know a lot of Scotsmen. It's an exaggerated character. And the exaggeration is intentional, and I think it's enormously shrewd, because people want to simply dismiss him as a drunken, angry, nostalgic, resentful person. He's like, I'll show you drunken, angry, nostalgic, resentful. I'll see it and I'll double it. There. And there's a lot of that in the culture war between the elites and the deplorables, who, of course, took that word on as a badge of their own courage. The man behind the character is himself a successful writer, so if you can get past the fast-cut populism the videos are thick with, and often I've sort of taken to just listening to them instead of watching them. Not that there's a problem with watching them, but when I watch them, I find a problem with watching them. Unlike something like stories of old, where he's gently, slowly crafting, intentionally taking every image, the critical drinker is just pop, 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 and sometimes you get the idea that he's just throwing images into it that he's grabbed from a trailer or something else, that the language, the words are the message. He's a writer, much more than the visual. He's not a director, he's a writer. Anyway, he is addressing something serious and real, the state of religious story in the West. If Peugeot and Peterson are playing it straight to a middle-brow and sometimes highbrow audience, the critical drinker is in deep cover. There's zero association with overt religion. The cussing alone should keep the pastor out of the bar. This level of Hollywood has long been the heart of folk religion in the West. Archetypes that used to be communicated by superstition, fairy tales, mythology, and folklore now live in popcorn movies, and their future is in peril. Movie theaters are temples, but now the message has moved into the religious altars of the god Set, and the pocket Bibles replaced by smartphones. And if you want to understand my reference to the god Set, watch the clip I made of...
You might not recognize it as Set, but I want to read you something. A few months before I was born, my dad met a stranger who was new to our small Tennessee town. From the beginning, Dad was fascinated with this enchanting newcomer and soon invited him to live with our family. The stranger was quickly accepted and was around to welcome me into the world a few months later. As I grew up, I never questioned his place in our family. Mom taught me to love the Word of God. Dad taught me to obey it. But the stranger was our storyteller. He could weave the most fascinating tales. Adventures, mysteries, and comedies were daily conversations. He could hold our whole family spellbound for hours each evening. He was like a friend to the whole family. He took Dad, Bill, and me to our first Major League Baseball game. He was always encouraging us to see the movies, and he even made arrangements to introduce us to several movie stars. The stranger was an incessant talker. Dad didn't seem to mind, but sometimes Mom would quietly get up, while the rest of us were enthralled with one of his stories of faraway places, and go to her room, read her Bible, and pray. I wonder now if she ever prayed that the stranger would leave. You see, my dad ruled our household with certain moral convictions, but the stranger never felt an obligation to honor them. Profanity, for example, was not allowed in our house, not from us, from our friends, or adults. Our longtime visitor, however, used occasional four-letter Four-letter words that burned my ears and made Dad squirm. To my knowledge, the stranger was never confronted. My dad was a teetotaler who didn't permit alcohol in his home, not even for cooking. But the stranger felt he needed exposure and enlightened us to other ways of life. He offered us beer and other alcoholic beverages often. He made cigarettes look tasty, cigars manly, and pipes distinguished. He talked freely, too much, too freely, about sex. His comments were sometimes blatant, sometimes suggestive, and generally embarrassing. I know now that my early concepts of the man-woman relationship were influenced by the stranger. As I look back, I believe it was the grace of God that the stranger did not influence us more. Time after time he opposed the values of my parents, yet he was seldom rebuked and never asked to leave. More than 30 years have passed since the stranger moved in with the young family on Morningside Drive. But if I were to walk into my parents' den today, you would still see him over in a corner, waiting for someone to listen to him, talk, and watch him draw his pictures. His name? We always called him Set. Television set.
Set.
I love that video. The critical drinker's angry, drunken mission is to preserve the craft of storytelling and rescue it from the message that seeks to destroy Western religion for the masses from the inside, the way it has happened in the church. And here I reference a very interesting video, Why Christian Movies Are Bad, the Problem with Christian Media. For this reason, The Critical Drinker is in many ways parallel to Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot, not simply because they are appealing to a similar audience, but because The Critical Drinker's satisfying storytelling is a gyroscope which can fallibly guide secularists to the transcendentals. He's doing so, however, from far deeper cover. He will revel in his deplorable status. I think of him as the Diogenes of this little corner, so prepare to be offended. And it wasn't till the end, and this is again why I do videos and why I write, that in a sense the image of the critical drinker as Diogenes of the trailer park really sort of hit home. And if you don't know who Diogenes is, he's the father of the school of cynics. And there are many interesting stories about Diogenes, and he's not far from the critical drinker. Now, the movie, or the video, I very much wanted to integrate was this question about villains, because it gets into evil. Something is going on with respect to evil that I think needs attention. Now, I don't remember if I introduced Carolina in the last video or not. I made so many takes of that video and threw so many takes away, I don't always remember what's in them and at them. She and I had a conversation in 2019. It wasn't published. Again, about a third of my conversations aren't published. But she has made a video, and all the usual bridgers or many of the usual bridgers are there in the comments section encouraging her and supporting her. That's exactly what a community should do. And for a first effort for a video, very well done.
It seems to me that we no longer have a notion of good and evil. As a society, as a culture, we have lost the ability to name good and evil, to use those words, especially in big cities, especially in liberal countries, but basically everywhere in large metropolitan areas around the world. Good and evil, and love as well. Love which is dismissed as being sentimental. Good and evil dismissed as being superstitious and old-fashioned. These are words that represent something about the real of life. And whether we have the words for it or not, it doesn't change the fact that they do exist, and that perhaps they are the most important aspects of life. And not being able to name them is actually dangerous, because when you don't recognize something, when you don't have the words for it. You can't integrate it into your symbolic understanding of the world, so then it's pushed away. And if you can't recognize evil, then it is hidden in the unconscious.
Now, what she does here in the beginning of this video, I think, hits a number of points that are important. And again, one of the slides that I don't even remember if it came to light has to do with nominalism. And again, John Vervaeke's definition of nominalism is that nominalism asserts that there are no real relations. What does that mean? It means that all of our relations are projection. What's the implication of that? Good and evil are relations. And now this complaint about no reality of evil has sort of been a trope from the right for a long time. It's not a trope without justification, but if it's not presented properly or explored properly, it's too easy a trope. And so her point here, which I think she made very well, is part of the reason we use language is because, as in our conversation with egregores, as in our conversations with Jesus demands the name of Legion, sometimes things need to be named so they can fit into our cognitive space. And once they are named and revealed, well, then at least we have a better chance of understanding, of seeing what they are and figuring out how exactly we must respond and deal with them. And this is where I get to the Critical Drinker video about villains.
Allow me to regale you with a story, dear viewer. Back when I was about 13... back when I just reached the legal drinking age in Scotland, one of my mates challenged me to drink a half bottle of Chinese moonshine. Now, I'd never tried this stuff before, and as I found out later, neither had he. But anyway, I duly popped the cork, which was secured with duct tape for some reason, and got fired in about it. Now, I've consumed some unpleasant beverages in my time, let me tell you, but this stuff tasted like liquefied, decomposing dog. But a challenge is a challenge, and only a fucking pussy backs down from something like that, so a few minutes later I duly raised the empty bottle in triumph. Then I promptly threw up, pissed myself and passed out next to a dumpster behind Tesco. The point here is that without overcoming the challenge of that shitty drink, I never would have become the witty, intoxicated raconteur you see before you. Because when you get right down to it, every hero needs a good villain. What would Superman be without Lex Luthor? What would Batman be without the Joker? What would Captain Marvel be without Brie Larson?
Is that like a personal attack or something?
The antagonist of a story is actually a pretty interesting thing from a writing point of view. They can come in all different shapes and sizes, from physical powerhouses to calculating intellectuals, from honourable warriors to evil murderers. But whatever form they take, they all serve the same basic purpose. They're an obstacle for the protagonist to overcome, something that can challenge them to become better and stronger than they were before. They're basically the driving force behind the hero's journey. But it's more than just that. A good villain can challenge the very nature of who and what a hero is, and what the audience believes them to be. They can have justifiable motivations and complex personalities all of their own. The best ones can even make the audience question just who exactly the real villain is. In fact, the villains are often cooler and more memorable than the hero themselves. Why? Because unlike the hero, writers don't have to worry about making their villains likeable and relatable, so they can afford to take risks with them. They can indulge their wildest writing fantasies, creating the most despicable psychopaths, terrifying monsters, evil dictators, or cunning criminals imaginable. The more evil they are, the bigger the threat they pose, or the harder they test the protagonist, the more satisfying it is when the hero finally prevails. The problem is that good villains seem to be a dying breed these days. The awesome antagonists that used to dominate the screen and push our heroes to the very limits of their endurance are gradually being replaced by weak, Flaccid, forgettable imitations with none of the power and menace of their predecessors. And because they no longer present a challenge, there's no real payoff when they get defeated. Now, explaining how and why this is happening is going to take a bit of time, so strap in and prepare yourself for the Drinker's Writing Workshop. First up...
Okay, so we'll pause him there. That's a good introduction to it. And I don't know if I'll play the whole video, but I wanted, especially because of yesterday's video, to, again, contextualize this with respect to the hero's journey and all that we talked about yesterday in terms of the hero's journey as sort of an individualized piece. And what we're actually looking at is a... Strawn said that niche is actually correct, better than niche. So I'll take Strawn's word for it because he looks these kinds of things up on places like Wikipedia and internet dictionaries. But the niches, see, I always think of niches and something out of Dr. Seuss if I say niches. But this is an integral function in terms of the story shape that we've been looking at. So if this is our successive hero's journey that's sort of brought into much larger story structures, at each point, what's going to provoke the action of the hero, or the action of at least the heroic elements of the community, is going to be the villain. Spelling. There we go. Is going to be the villain. It's going to be the adversary that comes in and gets the drama going. And of course, Jess, I have to look up the video. Jess and Sherry did a video on the U-shaped story. I suspect it's in Randos United. So if Jess, send me a message, because I know you're probably following this quite closely, because this is very much in the area that you and Sherry and others have worked on in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and in that community. So the villain actually plays a vitally important role. And the quality of the villain is going to be important for the quality of the story. And minor villains, of course, are easily dealt with. Major villains are difficult to deal with. And Peter Kreeft actually made a point about this when he was highlighting the success of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because often writers have an easier time writing villains, as the Critical Drinker just noted, rather than writing heroes. Heroes are tougher to write, and I think it's for that reason that we've had a variety of inverted heroes, let's say like Tony Soprano. Northrop Frye, in fact, makes this very point when he's talking about the biblical series.
You find that a situation is presented in front of you which gradually becomes more ominous and threatening and foreboding of disaster to the characters that you are sympathetic with. But then there's a kind of gimmick or sudden shift in the plot. And eventually it moves towards a happy ending where everybody gets married, and the hero and heroine's real life is assumed to begin after the play is over, which is why the heroes and heroines of so many comedies are in fact rather dull people, and the main character interest is thrown on the blocking characters, like the parents who forbid them to marry or something of that kind.
So the blocking characters, as he said, are often the most interesting. Now, as I mentioned before, part of what's happening here, whereas in almost all of these secular conversation about the hero's journey, the focus is on David or Samson or Moses or Joshua, one of the earthly heroes. As I've mentioned before, predominantly in the story, the hero is the Lord. it is the Lord that is actually transforming the community, but the Lord is doing so through his agent. And that might be David or Moses. And in that way, I think in terms of biblical literature, you can have very interesting contextualized heroes because they are in fact flawed. And in many ways, I think that's part of the genius of biblical literature, because some of the inherent weaknesses in the U-shaped structure with the heroes is addressed already by virtue of the structure of biblical storytelling, where fundamentally, the Lord is the agent that brings transformation to the community through the interaction with the obstacles. But as I also mentioned yesterday, part of the issue with this is, especially in the Old Testament, Hasatan, which the accuser in the book of Job is very present and very, very functional in that, the villains in the Old Testament are, in fact, a little bit different. They are human. Now, part of oh, where's my copy? Where's my copy? I found it, my precious. Part of Kaufman's insight is that unlike many other mythical texts where the god has to do battle with other gods. Now, some of that is beneath some of the text, and we talk about that in Genesis 1, but it's very much sublimated because the god is confronting all sorts of other evil. And so what happens in the biblical narrative is that, let's say, the Babylonians are on one hand evil and understood to be evil. On the other hand, they are sent and used by God. And it's a very delicate narrative dance to have that pay off. And it's done so not quite directly and packaged as a movie or a story like you would find in a movie, but through basically the epigenetic layer of the Bible for us, which is usually the stories that we are lifting from the text and telling each other. Reading the text is not such a simple thing. There's the text that we appropriate from the text. So if the text is here, we have to fit this text into a schema that includes all of our story, our history, the language, the things we inherit, the status hierarchies that are going on. And so that then impacts the text we see. And it's sort of like an epigenetic layer because it's on top, and that's sort of our interpretive hash. I remember when I was dating the woman who would become my wife, her mother was a fundamentalist Baptist. Her father had been a Lutheran minister before he died. And Leo Peters in Grand Rapids, Michigan at that time in the 80s was taking out full-page ads in the Grand Rapids Press complaining about Calvin College and Howard Van Til and the biology department, et cetera, et cetera. So that war was going on. And my future mother-in-law and her fundamentalist Baptist family were all, of course, sided against Calvin College, but her daughter was going to Calvin College, and her future son-in-law was going to Calvin Seminary, and so conversations about Genesis 1 progressed. And I had done a little bit of work on Genesis 1, and so I challenged her one day to take out her King James version of the Bible and just read it as such. And fortunately for me, she was using the King James version of the Bible, not a number of other more modern translations that tend to cover over some of the inconvenient angularities left in the King James version. And so I was going through the Bible. I noticed that in pencil, she had been correcting it. And I said, you're not really supposed to do that. Oh, but I think it's wrong right here. In other words, she was reading the text that was in her mind, a product of all her filters, and when I pointed her to pieces in the text itself, well, this is sense making. This is how we make sense of the world. So we're always dealing with these multiple texts as we're trying to make sense of the world, trying to integrate the Bible into our filters and frames. All that leads to the question of who is the actor in the Bible, who are the villains, and in fact, where does evil come from, and how does it work?
Up, I'm going to give you an example of a well-written antagonist that everyone knows. And where better to start than Darth Vader? He's basically the quintessential movie villain. Right from the first moment he strides onto that rebel ship, surrounded by dead bodies, you know this guy isn't fucking around. In fact, George Lucas played just about every trick in the book to make you afraid of this guy. He's huge and powerful, he's dressed all in black armor, his face is hidden behind an inhuman mask, so you've got no idea what he actually looks like, and he speaks with a deep booming voice that just seems to radiate power and menace.
Where are those transmissions you intercepted? What have you done with those plans?
Shit man, he can even throw people around like ragdolls. Physically, he's big and intimidating, but he's also intelligent and ruthlessly efficient, making smart, logical decisions based on the information he has, and almost never losing his cool. For example, he uses his force powers to punish subordinates who fail or disrespect him, but it's never done out of anger or malice. He's either proving a point to men who doubt his power, or removing ineffective commanders who compromise the success of his mission. When Vader acts, it's always in service of a higher goal, and never because he's lost control of himself.
Okay, and now part of what he's showing us here is that evil always needs some good. Vader wants fealty, loyalty from his subordinates. He doesn't want them to lie. He wants them to tell the truth. And so what a well-written character and a good evil character will do is, in fact, have this mixture that, well, is present within us, and we have to figure out, well, this is the complexity of real life. Now, again, remember the critical drinker is, in many respects, operating on the level of folk religion. And when I think about other characters that I've seen, let's say Negan, I remember when Negan first stepped onto the stage of The Walking Dead, that night when he had some of the heroes of the story in the circle and he was going to take two of them out, I thought, wow, this character relates evil. But here's the question. What is evil and where is it located? Now, I'm not going to be able to offer you a definitive answer of this in this film. And this is part of why storytelling is so important, because most of the time we can't simply codify these things into language as such, as sort of Carolina was saying, to take them up and to grasp them and to contain them. Many times, the best way to communicate these things is with story. Why? Because actually, the story is a better representation of the 4P ways of knowing. A story has the depth to have the perspectival, the participatory, and all of those elements to it. In fact, film is quite capable of relating this kind of thing. In this video about Christian movies, he actually, let's see, I gotta only pop it in so we don't have the ads. He goes through at one point a scene which is really well done. Let's see if I can find it. This is all right. He goes through this scene and he just shows how the camera turns. Oh, come on. And he makes the point that even if you take away the take away the sound, you can have a sense of what's happening with these two characters and what's happening between them relationally, perspectively, and all of those elements. And it's partly that reason that film is such a powerful storyteller. There's so many things. See, notice, pull back, the emotions are different. Their faces are different. Now you add dialogue, you add music, you add all of that into this scene, and it's just a much broader palette. So we're going to have to talk about evil and talk about broad palettes and talk about the arenic and the agentic with respect to the valence of good and evil and masculinity and femininity. Now, the drinker has just laid out, especially at a folk religion level, a well-crafted character, and he's going to show us, and again, these are sort of tells down below of things up above.
The overall effect here is to create a villain that you absolutely would not want to fuck with. A man who basically dominates every situation and plows through every opponent over 3 movies, right until the final act, when Luke at last manages to overpower him. But even that counts as a kind of victory for Vader, whose objective was never to beat Luke anyway, but to provoke his rage and anger. And well, that's exactly what he does. The point...
And you get a sense of, again, the Ephesians text about principalities and powers, Ephesians 6. We died against flesh and blood. And in a well-crafted story, you actually have the ability to understand at a deeper level, even if you can't put it into words, that there is evil, and it is moving Vader, and the conflict between Luke and Vader is not simply something that will be resolved with lightsabers, and won't be resolved with the death of one or the victory of the other. And the movie actually affords a window into some deeper levels. At heart, the conflict is spiritual. Well, what do I mean by that? It's the forces that are moving the physical people and arranging them, that there's real relation between them, and that relation has moral valence, good and evil.
The point here is that George Lucas managed to create a villain that was smart, powerful, dominant, ruthless, interesting, and extremely well written. A character that maintains his air of danger and menace almost until his final moments, before redeeming himself and sacrificing his own life to save his son. Damn, no.
Okay, so, yeah. And of course, I remember when my children were going to secular high school. I'll refrain from certain comments about some of the education they received. But even in a secular high school, Christ figure, Christ figure, Christ figure. The Christian story has so deeply impacted storytelling since then. You get a sense of the neutron bomb that was Jesus Christ. All the stuff is standing, but the spirits had to go. This is the triumphal procession of the principalities and powers that over 2,000 years Jesus has been moving. And if you're looking at all these labels, Christian, non-Christian, I had a wonderful conversation about that today, actually. We'll see if that one gets shared too. The neutron bomb, for those of you who don't know it, back in the 80s, the American arms industry developed it, and this was something important that was believed could stop the fear of the Soviet advance, because the neutron bomb was mostly radiation, and so it would kill all the people but leave the stuff standing. That's in some ways the power of the exorcism that Christ does in his work, that wipes out the spirits and leaves the stuff standing. Now the stuff is going to have to be filled with a new spirit, because as Jesus says in his parable, clean out the house, and if you don't fill it with something right and something new, 7 more spirits worse than the first will come and inhabit it. So there's some vivid imagery about what's happening. And story here, good story, is again sort of like a gyroscope for the transcendentals. Truth, beauty, goodness. And if story is well crafted, even if it doesn't have the title of Christian on it, in fact, some stories that have the label of Christian on it are done so poorly, they don't function. Well, this is the power of story, and this is, in a sense, part of the natural revelation and glory of God that is built into creation, that one way or another we can't avoid it. For Darth Vader to be a successful villain, he needs to demand the goodness from the arena and the agents within the arena to pursue his evil purposes. One of the real interesting tricks of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters is that you have to figure out how to represent demons without making them leverage good in too overt a way.
No wonder he's so iconic. Now let's take a moment to consider his modern-day counterpart, Kylo Ren. I mean, superficially, the similarities are there. They both wear masks and black armor, they both make their entrance in the middle of a battle, they both use lightsabers, and they're both strong with the Force. And for the first few seconds, everything's going pretty well for Kylo Ren. He strides out of his ship, he kills an old guy that looks like he should be important, and he stops a fucking blaster bolt in mid-air. Damn, even Darth Vader couldn't do that. Then it all starts to go wrong when he tries to interrogate Poe.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?
The old man gave it to you.
It's just very hard to understand you.
And if you look at yesterday's video, this is what he means by lack of respect. Because, okay, we're on a strange planet, we've got blasters, we've got spaceships, we've got all of this stuff going on. We can suspend that disbelief. But the real relation, if you break that, and again, it's if you sit down and try to peel apart the layers of what is believable, what isn't believable, you can't do it. But we actually manage to manage these things in stories. It's an astounding capacity that we have. You don't catch your dog or your cat telling you a story. We do this, and we do it with so much subtlety that we put these stories in hierarchies. Again, look at the recent conversation between Peterson and Krauss. I mean, this is part of what Peterson is saying to the new atheist, is that, you're not really paying attention. Because if you look at this stuff, we have a sense of what's true and real. And it's to the grace of God that we can play with these things. But given the fact that we're allowed to play with these things, we're also allowed to make some messes. And you know what? Achievements are achievements. And the reason that they stand out is because they're really hard to do.
What the fuck is this? If you want us to take this guy seriously, you really shouldn't have people throwing snarky comments at him unchallenged. It's like the script is
Now let's give the Hollywood writers their due. What are they probably attempting to do? They are trying to show, probably, that evil villains in history are not necessarily archetypal. Hitler screwed up many times. Stalin screwed up many times. They were full of pettiness and all of these things. But here's the problem. Movies are abstractions that we're pulling out of things. And so it's vitally important, if you want to set up a good story, that you're dealing with archetypes. And that's why, based on a true story, it's always based on a true story, but once it's brought into film, certain transformations have to happen. They're demanded by the medium in order to achieve the goal of the medium. Now, we have the same issue with biblical narrative. It's just all there for poetry, of course, but we let it go by because it's poetry. And that gets back to, again, what Northrop Frye begins the second lecture with by saying, we can't tell, especially with the Bible, we don't know how to manage the split Where's the split? There's the split. We don't know how to manage this split. And again, this split is between upper and lower registers. And there's going to have to be a split. And as it dawned on me at one point today, enchantment is the space where upper and lower register meet. Right there is the zone of enchantment. And the problem with these movies is that if you don't get it right, you lose the enchantment. And we can all see it.
Actively making fun of him and encouraging us to laugh along with them. And it only gets worse from there. Whereas Vader was cold and efficient, Kylo frequently loses his temper and lashes out in childish rage. He makes dumb, illogical command decisions and pursues his mission in the least efficient way possible. He brutally punishes people for asking completely logical questions.
This fleet, what is it, a gift? What is he asking for in return? Does that...
In fact, the only reason he even catches up to our heroes is because just about everyone in the galaxy seems to be a fucking snitch. He regularly takes his mask off, destroying the mystery of what lies behind it. He's openly conflicted about the path he wants to take, hesitating at crucial moments, and endlessly brooding over his choices. Worst of all, every single time he goes up against the hero, he loses. First he fails to probe her mind with the Force, then he gets his fucking ass kicked in a fight, and it's only sheer dumb luck that stops him from getting killed. From that moment on, any threat or danger he might have posed is completely annihilated, because if your antagonist starts out weaker than the hero, then what the fuck is there left to strive against? The impression you get from Kylo Ren is that he's a weak, immature, conflicted man-child, desperately pretending to be something he isn't, exploding with childish displays of emotion whenever things don't go his way, and unable to commit to a course of action. A man who can't even master himself, never mind those around him, and consistently loses every time he tests himself against the hero.
Okay, let him
Short,
finish.
He's a villain without teeth. Never mind. Though, at least Snoke has a bit of potential. Oh. Well, there's always Hux. He started out pretty ruthless and...
Supremely...
Oh. You see how the script doesn't even have the decency to produce competent villains? Not only are these guys evil, but they're evil and inept. You're not supposed to fear them, you're supposed to laugh at them.
Okay, now, let's again talk a little bit about biblical narrative with respect to this issue. Because if you look at history, you'll find that many people who are villains through history possess all of these different flawed traits. Now, the problem is, what do we do with this? So let's imagine you have a more complex world than strictly a materialist world. You've got the hero's journey, you've got a narrative arc, that you've got a U-shaped story here, and the hero is doing this, but of course the Lord, through the spirits, coming at it from both ways, are in fact participating in the drama. What does that mean? It means that whether it's the hero or the villain, ineptitudes, all sorts of things, good fortune, all sorts of things are functioning in terms of the overall working of the story. It's not just all up to the hero.
And it's not just Star Wars that has this problem either. Consider Yon-Rogg from Captain Marvel, a man who loses his first fight against her, then does basically nothing for the rest of the movie, until she finally gets bored and zaps him with absolutely no efforts, because...
I have nothing to prove to you.
At no point in this movie does he ever present the slightest threat to her, so why the fuck should we care when she beats him? Or how about Roman Sionis from Birds of Prey, a sadistic nightclub owner who pouts and cries and screams his way through the movie and needs constant emotional validation and reassurance from his henchmen? A man who comes across as insecure, unstable, needy, and generally kinda pathetic.
Now, Birds of Prey was a lousy movie. I saw it in the I had Movie Pass, and I watched it in the theater, and it was like, boy, there was 2 hours I'm not going to get back. And partly for exactly the reason that he's pointing out here. But when I was watching the movie, I didn't appreciate the point he was making. And that's why he's helpful. Once I saw the critique, it was like, yeah, well, but let's ask ourselves, why are the villains falling apart? Now, it will have something to do as it gets to the end of the video with the message. And we're going to get into gender and masculinity and femininity, especially with respect to heroes and villains. Boy, I'm running out of time. This stuff is hard to make your way through. Part, I think, of the agenda of contemporary storytelling is they want to try to account for the evil in the characters. And they don't have this much world to play with. And so they do something different. As a culture right now, we have 2 stories going on. One is that of heroes. Heroes must be from the realm not of privilege. Again, part of this is because of the message. They can't be part of the privileged. They must come from the oppressed. They must come from the underdog. Now, you can see this in movies all the time, and it's not a problem at all. David is the youngest of the brothers. Moses is also a younger brother who has a speech problem. And so this is often, all of this comes from Christianity. All of this comes from the Bible. And it's just a matter of heresy versus not heresy. So God often takes the lowly of the world and raises them up. Look at Mary's song. But again, it's always God who does this. So the heroes come from the lowly, the oppressed, the underdog, and they have compassion because they know suffering. But it's also true that hurt people. And so villains also, now this has come about in the movies now, they also come from somewhere. Well, where does their evil come from? Well, their evil comes from some tragic thing. In other words, it's not their fault. Now, that's not a bad thing because, again, if you have a worldview that looks more like this, well, you can account for evil in a way. But if you don't have this worldview, what you wind up with is a conflict where we don't really know why some people, the Christians actually have all of these cliches that talk about this. The same sun that hardens clay melts wax. And this is something that, again, it's at the point between the registers. If you can go into that question, you find something, and you find enchantment, and you actually hold the tension, and you look at. Actually, a lot of this is where Calvinism is from, because in many respects, you just say we can't account for it, so God. That's in some ways part of what's beneath Calvinism.
And never gets to present an actual threat to the hero. Or what about Max Lord from Wonder Woman 1984, a shady businessman desperate to hide his failures behind a veneer of ballsy 1980s arrogance.
Now, again, in looking at this movie, the female villain sidekick was more. She was quite a bit more. She was more to deal with than he was.
Ballsy 1980s arrogance, who revels in the idea of power and success, but crumbles like a wet paper bag the moment his life is put at risk, and who is never able to threaten Wonder Woman in any way. And of course, let's not forget about Rowan from Ghostbusters 2016, a sad, middle-aged, socially inept loser with a superiority complex that's angry because everyone in the world looks down on him. Or how about Bosley from Charlie's Angels, played by a frail actor in his late 70s, whose plan gets easily uncovered and foiled by people who are clearly far more intelligent than him, before knocking him out with a single punch. The point I'm making here is that all of these characters make for shitty villains, either because they lack the self-control, fighting ability, intelligence, or sheer physical strength to be genuinely intimidating.
Now, part of this gets to why we want movies. I said on many occasions, a deep, problematic aspect of our culture is that for commercial purposes, we have attempted to brainwash generations that life should be easy and successful if you just follow a few simple rules. That's simply a lie about life in this world. And part of the reason Jordan Peterson, I think, was so successful is he presented a much more Augustinian view of the world that says, we are evil, life is hard. You'd better take that into account when you think about what this world will be. Now, we live in a tremendously affluent society that has been tremendously successful, and there are, in fact, people who have had fairly easy lives for good long stretches of their lives, and it tends to make them weak and soft. Now, there are others who have had very difficult lives, and it tends to make them bitter and, frankly, in some ways evil. This whole dynamic that I was pointing to before. And then there are others for whom the hardness of their life has turned them into saints. And that then leads us to the question of transformations and the degree to which we can participate in them, either from the inside or the outside.
They never present a tangible threat to the hero. In fact, they're basically treated as weak, pathetic strawmen that can be easily brushed aside once the script decides it's time for them to lose. The writers in this case lack the one thing that every creator should have for their antagonist, and that's respect for their creations. Darth Vader, Hans Gruber, Hannibal Lecter, the Terminator, the list goes on and on. But
and so you see from the video I played yesterday, this theme for him of respect comes in. And what do we mean by respect? Because we have respect between people. No, it's to one degree or another, the storyteller needs to really believe in their creation. And they need to take it seriously throughout the story.
But the thing that ties all these characters together is respect. The writers were smart enough to build their antagonists up, so they became a genuine threat for the hero to overcome, instead of trying to break them down and belittle them right from the beginning. Now, the thing you might rightly be wondering is why? Why is this happening? What exactly has changed? Well, quite a bit as it happens. See, the real problem here is that there are pretty strict rules around what you can and can't show in mainstream movies. And I'm not talking about boobs and violence like in the old days, I'm talking about the unwritten rules behind the scenes that basically exist to make sure their movies don't incur the wrath of journalists.
Now, he's going to get into the message here, and that is a fair point. But there are also more structural rules about the real relations of our world that these elements fit into, and that's why the message destroys stories, and sometimes in the same way that the Christian message, remember Eugene Peterson, his paraphrase of the Bible is called The Message, destroys Christian movies. That it takes it creates a world that to us we look at and we say, that's unreal. And sometimes it's a fantasy world and we want to live into it. And both Christians and wokesters suffer from the same kinds of delusions in that sense sometimes. But this is where, in fact, good storytelling is durable. And these durable things, therefore, are tells and signs and clues of the deeper realities underneath all the physicality that we're watching.
News media or the endless Twitter mobs just waiting for the next thing to get offended about. In this case, one of the golden rules is that women are never allowed to lose to men at anything for any reason. Whether it's a physical fight, a test of skill or intelligence, or even a simple argument, pick basically any scenario where a woman gets pitted against a man, and I can pretty much guarantee you the woman will come out on top.
Now, Peugeot, one of his most popular videos was, of course, about this directly.
Important aspects of interpreting symbolism in culture is the capacity to discern patterns not only within stories but also across them. The capacity to notice these patterns will help us see when certain directions, certain deep movements and changes are taking form in culture. It will give us the capacity to, let's say, read the signs of the times. Sometimes an understanding of symbolism can be used for purposes of propaganda and to push certain social agendas. This trope is the replacing of the masculine hero by a feminine one. We see this pattern not only in the fact of certain replacements, but it often appears as a pattern within the stories themselves.
Casper?
He wasn't really Ghostbusters material.
So it's not just that there are more lead feminine characters in stories, which could have been, an opportunity.
And again, for those of you who don't know the Ghostbuster canon, Bill Murray was one of the original Ghostbusters. And so the idea, again, as I played before, the video before from Peugeot, is replacement.
Opportunity for good storytelling. But it is the very act of supplanting and replacing which is often shown as a story trope. And this trope becomes boldly apparent, especially when we see this pattern appear across several movies. The pattern can...
Now remember, we not only lift our stories up from watching real life, we also lift our expectations and our filters up from watching these things over stories. And the movies are the most powerful religious formation, one of the most powerful religious formation devices, especially at the folk religion level in our culture.
It can take a variety of forms. It can appear as a strange play on the masculine virtue of wanting to save others. Though now, the male character sacrifices himself in order to make way for a feminine character which replaces him. We see this, for example, in the movie Logan. Wolverine sacrifices himself to make way for his female clone. There is also Kay in Blade Runner 2049, giving up his place as the son to make room for the daughter.
You imagined it was you. Oh.
Useless.
Our plan, Captain? Not Commander, right? Wasn't it Leia's last official act to demote you for your Dreadnought plan?
But there are several occasions where the masculine character will willingly get out of the way to make place for a feminine replacement. In the final scene of the movie Mad Max Fury Road, after tossing the dead body of the tyrannical father, Max presents the female lead to the people, who clamor for her. And Max then gets off this escalating elevator in order to let all the feminine characters ascend to replace the toppled authority.
Now, the masculine and the feminine are not arbitrary.
But and she's wise because she doesn't fall for the status markers, and he's completely nonplussed by this because he's
talking about Beauty and the Beast.
He's devoted his whole life to just developing the status markers. And so I think it's Beauty and the Beast is there's a hero's journey in that's very deep. And some of these fairy tales, some of them have been traced back like 12 to 13,000 years. And so if it's that old, it's like 100,000 years.
Right. Right. But this actually goes to a point that you and I have been dancing around forever, Jordan, which is the point about to what level are these very ancient things effectively timeless, and to what level are these things in need of change because we now face an environment for which they were not built. And so the hero's journey, I would argue, just painting with a broad brush, the hero's journey is timeless. What does the hero's journey look like? Well, it can look like Odysseus, or it can look like the Fellowship of the Ring, right? Those are very different versions of the hero's journey. And in fact, at the moment, one of the things that we need are stories that are not built by the market to fill some need, but that actually reflect the transition in what males and females do in the world. That in some sense, one of the positive things that
Now this is a really interesting point that Brett is making, because now you have to understand Brett is he's pure IDW. What it means is that he's a wokesters have committed domicide against his home. He is no longer at Evergreen, and I won't call it a junior college, Nate, don't worry, I've learned my lesson. He's no longer at Evergreen, but there are many pieces of the code that he wants to keep in. So now, well, what we need to do is we need to, in fact, do this replacement that reflects the changes to our world. We need to have representation. And so that is obviously behind the dynamics that Peugeot was just pointing out.
That has flown from birth control is that women, because they can now engage in family planning that works, are free to compete with men in every realm that isn't physical.
Yeah, well, one question we're wrestling with is, well, are women just men then?
They are not.
Right, since the birth control pill. Well, but they are in some way, which is just what you said. They're way more like men than they were before 1950.
We are freed
because
from
they have control. Yes, exactly. And so part of what we are trying to sort out in our culture is, well, to what degree are they just men, or better men even? I mean, look what's happening to university enrollment, for example. And so we don't know. And that issue of universality. So a student once asked me in one of my classes at Harvard, it's like, well, if these stories are archetypal, why don't we just tell the same story over and over? Like exactly the same story. Mm. And I thought, that's a really good question. And then I thought, well, there's actually an answer to that in Christian symbolism. So one of the things that's really strange about Christian thinking is, well, there's God, so he's the sum of all good. Very abstract, though. Maybe he's a father, but he's way out there, and who knows what to do with him. But he's really abstract. Well, you have to take that abstraction and make it concrete. You have to make it embodied, right? You have to make it incarnated. And so I'm speaking psychologically about the story, not religiously. So to bridge that gap between the ideal image, which is archetypal and universal, and the particularity, the way the Christian imagination solved that problem was to say, well, that ideal was embodied in a particular time and place, which seems extremely arbitrary. But that's us, right? Because we are arbitrary embodiments of that, whatever that abstract humanity is. And we have to particularize the universal to our time and place. And that's why we need new storytellers all the time.
Now, he's embodied in a male. Is that arbitrary? I'm running out of time right now, so I'm going to have to do another video, but this is where we have to go. Now, I want to go back to the critical drinker, because the end of this video is pretty important when it comes to this issue of gender. Now we just again heard that part of what has happened is we're no longer living in a context where this sexual dimorphism, which they talk about, which has, men, we're larger, we're physically stronger, we have a variety of other attributes. Women have other strengths. In many ways, women are more robust than men. They don't get as sick as we do. They live longer than we do. So, there's all these balances, but they're not the same. And so when Peterson says, well, are men and women the same now? Isn't this exactly what we're trying to figure out? But well, let's let the drinker talk a little more.
She'll either outsmart the man in a battle of wits, or get the last word in an argument, or kick his ass in a fight, regardless of their relative size and strength. Whatever it might be, the rules dictate that no man can beat a woman in a balanced engagement, because the natural implication would be that men are smarter, or stronger, or generally better than women, and we certainly can't have that. Now this is all well and good, but it creates a very obvious problem when you're...
It creates a lot of problems, because to the degree that women are going to buy this propaganda, they're going to have a problem, because there is in fact a reality out there, and we're bumping into that in a whole variety of ways in the culture now.
Your hero happens to be female and your villain male. Traditional storytelling requires the antagonist to start out stronger and more dangerous than the hero, forcing them to grow and improve themselves in some way before...
Okay, let's slow this down, because what he does right here is really important when it comes into the question of male and female.
Finally, dangerous male, but it creates a very obvious problem when your hero happens to be female and your villain male. Traditional storytelling requires the antagonist to start out stronger and more dangerous than the hero, forcing them to grow and improve themselves in some way before...
There's the U-shape. The Philistines, I mean, just read the book of Samuel. The Philistines, they have a monopoly on ironworking. They are, in a sense, they are a regional power. They are, from the Sea Peoples or the Greeks, they are in this area. They are something to be contended with. Israel is outmatched. And what you see again and again in the biblical story, Israel versus Egypt, they're slaves in the land. They are outmatched. And again, Israel is outmatched. That story where they have to keep Moses' hands in the air. The point is, Israel is constantly outmatched. They are outmatched against Egyptians. They are outmatched against Babylonians. They are outmatched against Assyrians. They are outmatched against Philistines. The only way Israel has a chance is God. Now, again, y'all hear that with a whole lot of framing that has gone on, God number 2, but we're going to have to get into God number 1 and God number 2, masculine and feminine, good and evil, because the Lord, masculine, his intervention to rescue Israel is at the heart of the story, which sets up Israel's inability to keep the covenant, which sets up the entrance of masculine Jesus into the space. Now, I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to finish this story in this video. I'll have to come back to it, and I hope I do, because sometimes these things get lost. But I know this is sensitive territory that we're dealing with here, because very quickly a whole bunch of things are rushing into a lot of our imaginations. Say, well, Pastor, then men and women, rules, should they, what they can do, what they can't do. Lay all of that set aside. Let's deal with the masculine, the feminine, the structure of this stuff before we deal with any of those other questions. And, I'm a Christian Reformed minister who has trained, encouraged, and worked with the development of women clergy. And I know right there, I just rubbed a whole bunch of you the wrong way. And a whole bunch of some of the rest of you are like, yeah, but Vanderclay, ever since you got on this Jordan Peterson thing, you just can't trust you. Yeah, well, there you go. We all have our problems, don't we? But this issue that the critical drinker puts his finger on is critical in terms of storytelling.
Finally, dangerous male, but it creates a very obvious problem when your hero happens to be female and your villain male. Traditional storytelling requires the antagonist to start out stronger and more dangerous than the hero, forcing them to grow and improve themselves in some way before finally prevailing at the end.
Forcing the Lord to set up these narratives and develop Israel have Israel grow up to be his son.
But naturally, this process requires the man to be dominant in the early stages, and as we've already discussed, that's not allowed to happen anymore, even if it's just a temporary thing. So how exactly...
So, in other words, this one agenda that, we need new stories that show women as what? As masculine? Many masculine women, we've all known that. It's not a matter of male and female, it's a matter of masculine and feminine. And what Peugeot has pointed out a number of times is that feminine power has been driven from the screen. Masculine and feminine are not disconnected from male and female. The relationship is complex, but they're not disconnected. And again, I've got a bunch of clips that I want to go into to talk about that, and I'm not going to get a chance to get into them. But what the critical drinker just pointed out here in terms of storytelling that lifts up things for us to sort of deal with things like Carolina said, evil. I mean, she's Polish, so she's dealing in a second language to make a video. It's very impressive, especially to American. We're so monolingual. But evil, this is the level that we're dealing with these stories.
How do you get around it? Well, if you happen to write for Disney, Marvel, DC, or Lucasfilm, you don't. Instead, you're forced to make your villains weak and pathetic, either unfairly elevated beyond their abilities, or jealous and envious of the hero's success.
So this is another reason why villains are deprecated. And, well, what's the problem with them being deprecated? Well, we're losing stories. And the stories aren't believable because almost all of us face adversaries in our life we cannot overcome. Look at the Balrog, the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Fly, you fools. This foe is beyond any of you. Swords are no use. We all face foes like that regularly. And now you have no heroes. And the villains aren't up to it because the villains in my life, the forces of evil that I contend with, of all around me, that I have no ability to overcome. Where can my help come from? These folk stories offer nothing. They can't even set up the story properly. And, well, so then why? Brett is talking about the marketplace. The marketplace is speaking. And again, I'm not one to say that the marketplace, the image I have of the potential for evil in the marketplace and agentic evil is far richer and thicker than Brett Weinstein's. This is a problem. And this is what the Critical Drinker is bringing forward.
It's basically a form of projection, allowing the writers to vent their frustrations about imagined enemies and rivals.
It's deeper than just frustrations.
Onto a weak straw man that can be easily swept aside by an all-conquering heroine. Unfortunately, this whole mindset creates more problems than it solves. Weak villains make for weak stories because they rob the narrative of its tension and drama. Even worse, it actually undermines the hero themselves, because if they're never really tested by a worthy opponent, then they haven't really achieved anything. A hero is only ever as strong as the villain they defeat. And what's really interesting is that the problem still exists even if you reverse the roles. Take Thor Ragnarok for example. The villain in that movie is a woman, which is perfectly fine at the beginning when she gets to kick Thor's ass, but it becomes a real problem near the finale when it's time for him to win. You definitely can't show Thor hammering a woman into the ground, because that brings up all kinds of unpleasant accusations of glorifying violence against women.
Pause. It does, doesn't it? Do you want that?
So when it brings him to win, you definitely can't show Thor hammering a woman into the ground, because that brings up all kinds of unpleasant accusations of glorifying violence against women. So instead, the movie takes the best alternative and has a third party step in to win the battle for him.
Okay, and that's not necessarily a bad move, but it doesn't really get away from the problem that he's just pointed out. That if, in fact, the female threat had used feminine power to own Thor and to beat him, well, then that would be perfectly okay. The difficulty is, well, there are limits in terms of story. To show feminine power is something that it seems people are completely oblivious to, partly because of the way that the message has been generated in our realm.
Notice how they carefully managed to sidestep the uncomfortable issue of Thor defeating her in a fair fight. Just a little something to think about there. The point I'm making is...
and he should pause. Just a little something to think about there, because these aspects are not incidental.
Is that the reason people didn't warm to characters like Rey or Captain Marvel isn't because of their gender, it's because everything's made so fucking easy for them that it's basically impossible to feel any empathy. It's the same exact problem with...
And if you're using a female, why not give her feminine power? Well, we don't know what that is. Do you believe, and are you asserting to the world that masculine power always triumphs over feminine power? Well, we don't know what feminine power is. We can't generate a story about this. Where might we find stories about this? You can find stories in the Bible of women exercising masculine power. You know, a spike through the skull. You want to see a story in the Bible about feminine power? Why don't you look at Esther? Why don't you look at Ruth? There are stories in the Bible of feminine power. There's also stories in the Bible of feminine evil. Let's finish it off.
Ghostbusters, or Harley Quinn, or Charlie's Angels, if your heroes do nothing but plough their way through a collection of unthreatening, neutered enemies, then you'll never get your audience to care about their struggle, because they don't fucking have one.
And if they don't have a struggle, your audience basically isn't able to use the movie to meet their religious needs.
So what exactly is the solution here? Well, ironically enough, the solution is equality. And I mean real equality, not the bullshit Hollywood version that makes one side artificially weaker just to make the other look superficially strong. If you want your female heroes to be respected equally, then you have to put them through equal struggles against worthy enemies. You need to stop nerfing your villains in a vain attempt to avoid offending people on social media, because honestly, the more you try to appease them, the more you compromise your ability to tell a decent fucking story. If you want kick-ass heroes that people can look up to, then you need to give them kick-ass antagonists they can be afraid of. In short, you need to give your villains their fucking balls back. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
Okay, I'm out of time. I'm going to give a little teaser here. We're going to have to talk about good and evil. And we can use that up and down for that in terms of a y-axis. But for an x-axis, we're going to have to talk about, there's no axis in here. But we're going to have to talk about the relationship between the masculine, the agentic, and therefore God number 2, and the feminine, the arenic, which then ties us into God number 1. So I'm going to be playing with these ideas. This scares some of you. This scares me. But I think we have to explore it and ask questions about, okay, how does this work? Because we seem to be knocking on this door when we're dealing with the structure of story. And do these things tell us anything? So that's it for today. You don't have to go away. Just leave a comment and let me know what you think, because this is going to get interesting.